For most people, the global order feels invisible. You go to work, you buy gas, you check your bank account, you order something online, maybe it comes from China, maybe it was shipped through the Strait of Malacca. Maybe the payment moved through a banking network you have never heard of. Maybe the price was shaped by a central bank decision made thousands of miles away by people whose names you will never know. But behind all of that is a system, a game, and for nearly 80 years, that game has been controlled by one country more than any other, the United States. The question now is whether that game is beginning to break. Because what we are seeing today is not just another cycle of tension between Washington, Beijing, Moscow, and the rest of the world. It is something deeper. It is a challenge to the basic structure that has governed global power since the end of World War II. It is a fight over who writes the rules, who controls the money, who protects the trade routes, who sets the price of energy, who decides which country rises, and which country gets trapped. When a system that large begins to shake, it does not only affect presidents, generals, bankers, and diplomats. It affects ordinary people. It affects the price of food. It affects the value of savings. It affects jobs, factories, housing, debt, energy, inflation, and even the stability of governments. To understand where we are headed, we have to understand how this system was built in the first place. And it did not begin with America, it began with Britain. For more than a century, the British Empire dominated the world through three powerful tools. The first was money. The Bank of England became one of the most important financial institutions in modern history because it could absorb capital from across the world. Wealthy elites from Europe, Asia, and beyond could move their money into the British system where property rights were protected and capital could be preserved. That gave Britain enormous influence. If local elites in India, China, Southeast Asia, or the Middle East wanted to protect their fortunes, Britain offered them a deal: cooperate with the empire, profit from the system, and move your wealth into a legal and financial structure backed by British power. This was not just colonialism by force, it was colonialism through incentives. Britain understood something very important. An empire is much easier to maintain when local elites benefit from it. If the people at the top of a conquered society can protect their wealth by aligning with the empire, then they often help the empire rule. The second tool was soft power, English education, British universities, literature, the BBC, Oxford, Cambridge, the prestige of speaking English. All of this created an empire that did not depend only on soldiers and ships. Britain became not just a military power, but a cultural model. Even long after the British Empire declined, British soft power remained embedded in global institutions. People still learned English to enter the global system. They still looked to British universities for prestige. They still saw British law, British finance, and British education as symbols of legitimacy. That is the hidden power of empire. The flag can come down, but the habits remain. And the third tool was the Royal Navy. The Navy controlled sea lanes, and whoever controlled the sea lanes controlled trade. Trade meant wealth, wealth meant influence, influence meant empire. For a long time, that system worked. Britain could project power across oceans, protect trade routes, move goods, finance wars, and discipline rivals. It became the first truly global empire because it connected distant regions into one imperial network. But Britain had three major limitations. First, Britain was still tied to race, ethnicity, an empire in the old sense. It was an Anglo-Saxon imperial project. The British saw themselves as separate from and superior to the people they ruled. That attitude helped them dominate, but it also limited how far the empire could go. Eventually, the people under British rule wanted independence. India rebelled, colonies broke away. The empire could not absorb the world into itself because it never truly saw the world as equal participants. It could rule people, but it could not fully include them. That difference matters. Second, Britain's wealth system was limited by gold. For centuries, wealth was understood through gold, land, and physical assets. But gold is finite. If wealth depends on gold, then the game has limits. Only a small elite can fully participate because there simply is not enough gold for everyone to play. A gold-based order can be stable, but it cannot easily become universal. It is a game for empires, banks, kings, and elites, not for billions of people across the planet. Third, Britain was physically too small. It was an island with limited resources and a limited population. It could dominate the seas, but it could not indefinitely control the entire world against rising continental powers like Germany, Russia, and eventually the United States. America inherited Britain's empire-building model, but it solved Britain's limitations. The United States was not a small island, it was a continental fortress, protected by two oceans, rich in land, minerals, rivers, farmland, energy, and people. America had the scale Britain never had. And beyond the United States itself, Washington gradually came to dominate the Western Hemisphere as a strategic zone. That gave America an enormous advantage. No rival army could easily invade it. No neighboring power could seriously threaten its core territory. It had access to food, energy, industry, capital, and immigration at a scale Britain could never match. America also solved the currency problem. Instead of building the global system around gold alone, America eventually made the US dollar the center of world wealth. That changed everything. Gold is limited, dollars are not. Once wealth became tied to the dollar, the game could expand infinitely. Everyone could participate, every country could trade, every bank could transact, every government could hold reserves, every corporation could borrow, invest, and grow inside a system whose center was the US dollar. But America's most important innovation was political. America presented itself not as an ethnicity, not as a tribe, and not even just as a country. America presented itself as a game. The American idea was simple. Come here, follow the rules, work hard, build wealth, and rise. That is the American dream. Of course, the reality has never been perfect. America has had slavery, racism, inequality, corruption, exclusion, and deep contradictions. But as an organizing myth, the American dream was incredibly powerful. It told the world that America was open. It told immigrants that they could become American. It told ambitious people that talent and effort mattered. It told investors that property rights would be protected. It told entrepreneurs that the rules were clear enough to play. And it told the world that America was not merely a nation. It was a system. That system was written into the Constitution. The American government was designed as a structure of checks and balances. The president, Congress, and the Supreme Court all had different roles. Power was divided, law stood above individual rulers, property rights were protected, the courts enforced contracts. The government existed not only to rule, but to maintain the game. This made the United States expansionist by nature. If the game worked, it needed more land, more people, more capital, more markets, and more participants. That is why America pushed west. That is why America fought internal battles over who could participate. And that is why the Civil War was such a defining moment. The North and South were not just fighting over territory. They were fighting over two economic systems. The South was based on slave labor and plantation agriculture. The North was based on free labor, industry, finance, and expansion. Slavery was not just a moral crisis, it was also a contradiction inside the American game. If the game promised fairness, openness, and opportunity, then slavery exposed that promise as a lie. The North won because its system was more scalable. It had more industry, more people, more energy, and a stronger connection to the future of capitalism. After the Civil War, the American game expanded across the continent. Railroads connected markets, factories grew, banks expanded, immigration surged, cities exploded. The United States turned itself from a frontier republic into an industrial giant. But then it hit another problem. Capitalism concentrates wealth. The longer the game runs, the more money tends to flow upward. Eventually, fewer and fewer people control more and more of the system. By the early 20th century, the United States had become rich, industrialized, and powerful, but also deeply unequal and unstable. Then came the Great Depression. The American system nearly collapsed from within. Millions lost jobs. Banks failed. Confidence disappeared. Capitalism itself seemed to be on trial. But World War II gave America the opportunity to do something no empire had ever done at that scale. America globalized its own game. In 1944, before the war had even ended, the United States gathered allied nations at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire. The goal was to design a new global economic order for the post-war world. The result was revolutionary. The US dollar became the world's reserve currency. Other currencies would derive value in relation to the dollar. International trade would be priced through the dollar. Central banks would hold dollars, global finance would move through dollar-based institutions. To reassure the world, America promised that the dollar would be linked to gold. That was the original Bretton Woods bargain. The world would trust the dollar because the dollar could be exchanged for gold. And because gold was limited, the dollar would supposedly remain disciplined. But the genius of Bretton Woods was not only monetary. It created the architecture of American-led globalization. America also helped create institutions to expand and enforce the game. The World Bank would provide loans for development. The International Monetary Fund would step in when countries faced financial crises. Trade rules would gradually evolve through agreements like GATT and later the World Trade Organization. Banking networks and financial systems would connect the world more tightly together. And behind all of it was the American security umbrella. The U.S. Navy protected the sea lanes, American markets absorbed global exports, American banks financed global growth. American institutions set the rules. This was not just economics, it was empire by infrastructure. Instead of directly colonizing the world like Britain, America created a system that other countries wanted or needed to join. If you wanted development, you needed loans. If you wanted trade, you needed access to markets. If you wanted energy, you needed dollars. If you wanted reserves, you held U.S. Treasury bonds. If you wanted security, you aligned with Washington. The genius of the American empire was that it often did not look like an empire at all. It looked like globalization. It looked like free trade. It looked like development. It looked like modernization. But every road led back to the dollar, and every dollar led back to American power. But the system had a major vulnerability. America began spending more than it could honestly support. The Vietnam War, the space race, the Great Society programs, Cold War military commitments, all of this required enormous money. Foreign governments began to worry that America did not actually have enough gold to back all the dollars it had created. France and others started demanding gold in exchange for dollars. And in 1971, President Richard Nixon ended the dollar's convertibility into gold. That moment changed the world. The dollar was no longer backed by gold. It was backed by demand. The dollar remained valuable because the world still needed it. That is the crucial point. After 1971, the dollar became less like a traditional currency and more like the operating system of the world economy. It worked because everyone used it, and everyone used it because everyone else used it. So America had to make sure the world continued to need dollars. One of the most important ways it did that was through oil. Washington reached a strategic understanding with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. Oil would be priced and traded in US dollars. That created the petrodollar system. If countries needed oil, they needed dollars. If they needed dollars, they needed access to the American financial system. That kept global demand for the dollar alive even after the gold link was broken. This was one of the most important strategic moves of the 20th century. Oil was not just energy, oil was life. Oil powered factories, armies, trucks, ships, aircraft, agriculture, plastics, and the entire modern economy. By connecting oil to the dollar, America connected the survival of industrial civilization to its currency. But America did something else that was just as important. It brought China into the system. This is one of the most consequential decisions in modern history. Beginning with Nixon's opening to China and accelerating in the decades that followed, the United States allowed China to enter the American-led global economy. China received market access, China received foreign investment, China received technology transfers, Chinese students studied in American universities, Chinese factories became integrated into global supply chains. And American consumers bought Chinese goods on a massive scale. Why would Washington allow a communist country to become the factory of the world? The public explanation was that trade would liberalize China. A rising Chinese middle class would supposedly push the country toward democracy. Economic integration would make China more responsible, more open, and more aligned with the American-led order. But the deeper logic was about the dollar. As China traded with the world, it accumulated dollars. As Chinese exports surged, the dollar system expanded. As global supply chains moved through China, the American financial order became even more central to world trade. China became rich inside the American game, but China also became powerful, and that created the crisis we are living through today. Because a system can absorb a weak participant, it can manage a dependent participant, but when the participant becomes large enough to challenge the system itself, the relationship changes. That is what happened with China. China did not simply become a low-cost factory, it became a manufacturing civilization. It built ports, highways, high-speed rail, telecommunications networks, industrial clusters, shipyards, solar panels, batteries, electric vehicles, consumer electronics, and eventually advanced technologies. The United States believed it was bringing China into the American order. China learned the rules, used the system, grew inside it, and then began asking why America should remain the permanent referee. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, America stood alone. There was no rival superpower left to challenge it. Washington called this the New World Order, globalization accelerated, free trade expanded, supply chains stretched across continents, the dollar became the bloodstream of the global economy. But this system created a hierarchy. At the bottom were resources, oil, gas, grain, minerals, metals. Above that was manufacturing, the factories that turned raw materials into goods. Above that was knowledge, technology, design, intellectual property, education, innovation. And at the very top was finance, the ability to create money, price assets, control capital, and decide who gets access to liquidity. In this hierarchy, Russia and much of the global south provided resources. China became the manufacturing engine, Europe held knowledge, standards, and high-end industrial capacity. And America controlled finance. That was the arrangement. For a while, everyone appeared to benefit. Consumers got cheaper goods, corporations got higher profits, China grew at historic speed. The United States became the center of global finance. But underneath the surface, the system was becoming unstable. America hollowed out parts of its industrial base, China became too big to remain subordinate, Russia rejected its place as merely a resource supplier. The developing world grew tired of debt, conditionality, and dependency. And the 2008 financial crisis exposed the weakness at the heart of the system. When Wall Street collapsed, the entire global economy nearly went down with it. The United States had built a world where finance sat at the top. But when finance failed, everyone suffered. This was the moment many countries quietly began to rethink the system. If American finance could crash the global economy, why should American finance be trusted to manage it? If the United States could export crisis through its banking system, then maybe the dollar order was not as stable as it appeared. China responded with massive stimulus, infrastructure spending, construction, railways, airports, cities, and credit expansion. In many ways, China helped stabilize the global economy after 2008. But after doing that, Beijing wanted more influence. China began to argue openly and quietly that it deserved a larger seat at the table. It had become the world's manufacturing superpower. It held enormous dollar reserves, it had lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty, it had built infrastructure at a scale no one had ever seen. So China began moving outward. The Belt and Road Initiative was not just an infrastructure project. It was a strategy to build alternative routes, alternative markets, alternative supply chains, and alternative financial relationships. China did not necessarily need to destroy the American game overnight. It needed to make sure it could survive outside of total American control. That is the real meaning of diversification, more trade with Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. More access to resources not controlled by US allies. More payment systems outside the dollar, more institutions where Washington does not have veto power. More strategic depth. America saw this as a threat, and Donald Trump's trade war with China was not some random policy outburst. It was the beginning of a more open American recognition that China had become too powerful inside the very system America had built. Tariffs were one weapon, technology restrictions became another, semiconductor controls, sanctions, investment limits, supply chain relocation, military pressure in the Pacific, all of these are part of the same struggle. America is trying to preserve the rules of the old game. China is trying to rewrite enough of the rules to protect itself. Then came Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. That war revealed another weakness in the global hierarchy. Resources still matter. For decades, financial elites talked as if the modern economy had moved beyond raw materials. They spoke as if software, finance, services, and technology had replaced the old foundations of power. But you cannot manufacture without energy. You cannot feed populations without grain. You cannot build batteries without minerals. You cannot run factories without electricity. You cannot sustain armies without fuel. Russia understood this. By invading Ukraine, Moscow was not only fighting a territorial war. It was challenging the post-Cold War order and asserting the power of resources against the power of finance. Russia and Ukraine together are central to global grain, fertilizer, energy, and strategic geography. Disrupt that space and the shock moves through Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and Asia. That is why the war became global, even though the battlefield was local. Food prices moved, energy prices moved, European industry was shaken, sanctions reshaped trade flows. Neutral countries were forced to calculate their exposure. And every major power began asking whether the old rules still applied. That is why sanctions became one of the most important weapons. The United States and its allies froze Russian assets, cut Russian banks from parts of the financial system, and tried to isolate Moscow from dollar-based power. But this also sent a message to the rest of the world. If your reserves are held in dollars, can they be frozen? If your banks depend on Western systems, can they be cut off? If your economy runs through American-controlled networks, are you truly sovereign? That question is now driving the global reset. Countries are not all rushing to abandon the dollar tomorrow. That is not how global systems collapse. The dollar remains deeply powerful. It is still the dominant reserve currency. It is still central to trade, debt, banking, and global finance. But the psychology has changed. China is looking for alternatives. Russia has already been forced into alternatives. BRICS countries are discussing new settlement systems. Oil exporters are exploring non-dollar trade. Central banks are buying more gold. Regional powers are hedging. The world is not yet post-dollar, but it is no longer blindly dollar only. That is the fault line. And this is why today's conflicts are so dangerous. The United States is not simply defending Ukraine. It is defending the credibility of the system it built. China is not simply expanding trade. It is trying to escape permanent vulnerability to American financial power. Russia is not simply fighting for land. It is trying to break the assumption that the West can define the rules for everyone else. And the rest of the world is watching carefully. India is watching. Saudi Arabia is watching. Brazil is watching. Turkey is watching. Indonesia is watching. African states are watching. Middle powers are watching for one reason. They want to know whether the future belongs to one dominant system or whether they can finally maneuver between several. Because if the American game weakens, every country has to ask the same question: what comes next? A Chinese-led order, a fragmented multipolar world, regional blocs, currency competition, resource wars, financial instability, a new Cold War? The answer is still unclear. But one thing is becoming obvious: the old system is under pressure from every direction. The British Empire failed because it could not fully expand beyond its racial, geographic, and monetary limits. The American empire succeeded because it turned the world into a game built around openness, markets, finance, military protection, and the dollar. But now the very players America brought into the game are challenging the referee. China wants more control, Russia wants to break the hierarchy, the global south wants more autonomy, and America wants to preserve a system that still gives it extraordinary power. That is why this moment matters. This is not just about trade wars. It is not just about Ukraine. It is not just about China. It is not just about oil, gold, or interest rates. It is about the structure of global power itself. For 80 years, the world has lived inside the American-designed game. Now that game is entering a reset, and when global games reset, history tells us the transition is rarely peaceful, rarely clean, and rarely predictable. The most dangerous period is not when an old order is already gone. It is when the old order still exists, but rising powers no longer fully accept it. That is where we are now. America still controls the strongest currency. China controls the strongest manufacturing base. Russia controls critical resources. Middle powers are gaining leverage. And the global system is no longer moving in one direction. It is splitting slowly at first, then suddenly the world is moving from one order into another. The only question is whether that transition can be managed or whether the system breaks before a new one is born. This is *Strategic Faultline, and this is the story we will keep watching.